Greetings, YouTube. This is your half-baked libertarian podcast host, aka Drink Your OJ, and we're here to do another episode of the half-baked libertarian podcast because it's been a little while since I've posted any content, and y'all deserve something. And most importantly, I had to introduce my little half-baked libertarian guy that I had drawn for me that, I think maybe looks a little bit like me. I think maybe shares some things in common with me. But the difference is that the attitude of the half-baked libertarian is that libertarian ideas are good. And my attitude is that they aren't. So that's really our fundamental difference. But those are the things that we discuss here, free and openly, and not at all from a biased perspective. I am a recovering libertarian myself. I thought that libertarian ideas made sense for a long time. I still think that on their face, they seem to make a lot of sense. But it's when you start to dig a little bit deeper that they don't really hold up. And that's why I consider them, half-baked ideas. So what we do here is I like to use cannabis, and I think it is illustrative of the kind of thought patterns that a lot of libertarians have, which is that of a stoned philosophy, like freshman 101 student, which, I am not, but I never was. I studied computer science. I didn't look at any philosophy, but I have spent a lot of time in my life just in general looking at different political ideas and talking to a lot of different people and being very involved in politics. And, I was heavily involved with libertarian campaigns. And so I got to know a lot of libertarians pretty well. And that led me to finding out firsthand kind of how the sausage is made, so to speak. And not necessarily how it's made, but what it really is. And that they dress it up to make it more appealing to the average American, because if the average American really knew what they were about, they would not be in favor of any of it, I don't think. And so that's really my goal, is to try to take their, what seems to be academically sound kind of reasoning and expose the bullshit behind it. So with that in mind, a little bit of house cleaning. If you are new to the podcast, then please go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that you can be notified of any kind of new content that we put out, which isn't a lot. So whenever we do, it's very special. So you might want to know about it. And, if you don't like it, then you can always turn it off later. So no harm, no foul. Definitely destroy that like button, because apparently that's good for the YouTube algorithm, and we always want the YouTube algorithm on our side. And then there's that bell notification, which I may have confused with the subscribe button. I don't know. Those three things go together somehow. Use them at your discretion. Honestly, I don't really care. I'm not in this to make any money or really build an audience. I don't frankly care. I'll put out my videos. Maybe some people will watch them. Maybe some people won't. Probably most people won't. But they're out there, and I'll feel better for having put them out there. So that's really, really what this is about. It's therapeutic for me to get my ideas out there. And with that being said, let's go ahead and move into baking session number 1, where I can go ahead and do one of my favorite things. Which is to consume cannabis in a dab-like form. OG Chem is what I'm going to be using today. So I like to just do through a little bubbler, a little honeysucker, electronic nail, quartz, and then just suck up the OG Chem crystals straight from the jar. That's how I do it. Yummy, yummy, yummy. Shit. There's a thing that I wanted to mention here about the music that I've got, but I lost it. Here it is. Bingo. So this music is from Uppbeat.io. It's called Butterfly by Simon Folwer, and I will put a link for more details about it in the video description. So again, if you want more information about the music that's playing right here, I'll put a link in the video description for that. So yeah. So with that being said, and my first cannabis dab being ingested, let's get to some of our actual, content of this piece here. And again, as I mentioned, what we're really talking about here is how to deal with like libertarians in general coming up and steamrolling you at a party, or just like on Twitter, on Facebook, whatever. And because a lot of them are evangelists, and evangelists are very good at taking simple arguments and making them seem like kind of much more important or substantial than they really are. So, let's say you're at a party, you're enjoying a few drinks and some intelligent conversation with your friends, and someone you don't know comes up to you and starts talking about libertarianism. Oh no! Before you know it, you're being cornered in a debate with an evangelist for the philosophy, and you're not sure how to get out of it. But don't worry. Here's how to avoid being steamrolled by a libertarian and maybe even win the argument. Many libertarian arguments are like fundamentalist arguments. They depend upon restricting your attention to a very narrow field so that you will not notice that they fail outside of that field. For example, fundamentalists like to restrict their arguments to the Bible. Libertarians like to restrict their arguments to their notions of economics, justice, history, and rights, and their misrepresentations of government and contracts. There are some common counter-arguments for which libertarians have excellent rebuttals. Arguments that government is the best or only way to do something will almost certainly fail. There are many examples of many government functions being performed privately. Arguments based on getting any services free from the government will fail, as all government services cost money that comes from somewhere. Arguments that we have a free market are patently untrue. There's many ways in which the market is modified. There are a number of scientific, economic, political, and philosophical concepts which you may need to understand to debate some particular point. These include free market, public goods, externalities, tragedy of the commons, prisoner's dilemma, adverse selection, market failure, mixed economy, evolution, catastrophe theory, game theory, etc. Now, evangelists, which are those trying to persuade others to adopt their beliefs, generally have extensively studied which arguments have the greatest effect on the unprepared. Usually, these arguments are brief propositions that can be memorized easily and regurgitated in large numbers, and these arguments, by the process of selection, tend not to have obvious refutations. And when confronted by a refutation, the most common tactic is to jump to another argument. This eliminates the need for actual understanding of the basis of the arguments and greatly speeds up the rate at which evangelists can be trained. So, without preparation, even blatantly fallacious arguments may disturb or convince a targeted individual. Evangelists, who tend to be more interested in effect than in accuracy, don't tend to point out that there are usually lots of valid counter-arguments available, sometimes known for millennia. If the target is not the person spoken to, it may be a group of onlookers, such as the lurkers on social media or listeners on a podcast, we might expect that the discussion will focus on making the person spoken to seem wrong, ridiculous, uncomfortable, at a loss, etc. Small wonder why people are not interested in entering discussions with evangelists. They're likely to be outprepared, swamped, or worse, convinced by specious arguments, and possibly used as a cat's paw in the persuasion of listeners. The arguments we will discuss here are not straw man misrepresentations. They are all evangelistic arguments that have actually been made by libertarians. Many of them have been made frequently. Although they're often used evangelistically, we can't presume that someone making them doesn't understand their basis or cannot support their argument. Examples of questions used in this piece were largely sourced from a non-libertarian FAQ, version 1.5, which is another piece that was published. And so I'm reusing much of that content here as my source material. So let's dive into some arguments that you'll hear from one of them being that the U.S. government ignores the plain meaning of the Constitution. You know, this is often presented as the U.S. wouldn't be so bad if the government followed the Constitution. But plain meaning is a matter of opinion. A plain meaning one century can well be reversed in another, depending on popular usage, historical context, etc. Well-intentioned people can disagree on plain meaning endlessly, as we see in any non-unanimous court decision. For practical purposes, the meaning must be decided one way or another. So the next argument is that libertarians are defenders of freedom and rights. The reality is the foremost defenders of our freedom and rights, which libertarians prefer you to overlook, are our governments. National defense, police, courts, registries of deeds, public defenders, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, etc., all are government efforts that work towards defending freedoms and rights. So that's a fact. Another common argument that you will definitely hear is that taxation is theft. Two simple rebuttals to this take widely different approaches. The first is that property is theft. The notion behind property is that person A declares something to be property and threatens anybody who still wants to use it. Where does person A get the right to forcibly stop others from using it? Arguments about mixing of labor with the resource as a basis for ownership boil down to first come, first served. This criticism is even accepted by some libertarians and viewed favorably by David Friedman. This justifies property taxes or extraction taxes on land or extractable resources if you presume that the government is a holder in trust for natural resources. However, most people who question the creation of property would agree that after the creation of property, person is entitled to his earnings. Thus, the second argument. The second argument is that taxation is part of a social contract. Essentially, tax is payment in exchange for services from government. This kind of argument is suitable for defending almost any tax as part of a contract. Many libertarians accept social contracts. For example, essentially all minarchists must to insist on a monopoly of government. But of course, they differ as to what should be in the contract. Now, if you don't pay your taxes, men with guns will show up at your house, initiate force, and put you in jail. Now, of course, this is not an initiation of force. This is an enforcement of contract. In this case, an explicit social contract. Many libertarians make a big deal of men with guns enforcing laws, yet try to overlook the fact that men with guns are the basis of enforcement of any complete social system. Even if libertarians reduce all law to don't commit fraud or initiate force, they would still enforce with guns. Simple as that. Social contract. I never signed a social contract. There are several explicit means by which people make the social contract with the government. The most common is when your parents choose your residency and or your citizenship after your birth. And in that case, your parents or guardians are contracting for you, exercising their power of custody. No further explicit action is required on your part to continue the agreement, and you may end it at any time by departing and renouncing your citizenship. Immigrants, residents, and visitors contract through the oath of citizenship, swearing to uphold the laws and Constitution, residency permits, and visas. Citizens reaffirm it in whole or part when they take political office, join the armed forces, etc. This contract has a fairly common form. Once entered into, it is implicitly continued until explicitly revoked. Many other contracts have the same form. Some leases, many utility services such as phones and electricity, etc. The next argument is that the social contract is like no other because it can be unilaterally modified. This is simply not true. Consider the purchase of a condominium. You have a contract with the condominium association, agreeing to pay the fees that they levy for the services they provide and obey the rules that they create. And so you have an equal vote with the other residents on the budget and the rules. If you don't like the budget or the rules that are enacted, you can vote with your feet or persuade everyone to change them. There are numerous other common sorts of contracts that allow changes by one or both sides without negotiation. Gas, electric, oil, water, phone, and other utility services normally have contracts where at most they need to notify you in advance when they change their rates. Insurance companies raise their rates, and your only input is to either pay the new rate or vote with your feet. The exception is when rates are supervised by government regulatory agencies, of course. Pardon me while I wet the whistle here. It might be time for another dab break. Yeah, I'm feeling the dab break. A little bit more OG cam in the system here. All right. So back to these specious, half-baked libertarian arguments here. The last that we discussed was that the social contract is like no other because it can be unilaterally modified. So they will make... oh, my screen's not updating here. Hold on, let me try to fix that. Let's see what the deal is. There we go. So they will make other miscellaneous claims denying the social contract. Some complain that the social contract is fundamentally unjust because it doesn't treat people equally, that people are taxed unequally or receive services unequally. But, my answer is, so what? Like insurance, rates can vary from individual to individual, and services received may be more or less than premium is paid. Some complain any contract where the enforcing agency is one of the contractors is hardly fair. But the U.S. Constitution is a contract between several parties, the three branches of the government, the states, and citizens. It's a multilateral contract where every party is subject to enforcement by one or more of the other parties, and every party is involved in enforcement for at least one other. This pattern of checks and balances was specifically designed with precisely the fairness issue. The next argument, why should I be coerced to leave if I don't like the social contract? Well, my answer to that is, why leave an apartment if you change your mind about the lease? The answer is that you do not own the apartment, just as you do not own the nation. At most, you may own some property within the apartment, just as you may own some property within the nation. The next question that sometimes comes up is, did Cubans under Castro agree to their social contract? If you define contracts as voluntary, then you probably wouldn't say the Cuban government operates by a social contract, since most people who wanted to emigrate have not been permitted to. Most libertarians have a peculiar definition of voluntary. Contractual agreement makes all requirements of the contract voluntary, no matter how unexpected they are, no matter how long the contract lasts for, no matter if the contractee changes his mind. However, they're seldom willing to view our social contract in that manner. Our social contract in the USA is one of the nice voluntary contracts that libertarians should like. Even better, because you can terminate it by leaving at any time. There is no U.S. government obstacle to emigration from the U.S., which then may raise the question, isn't that love it or leave it? To which I say, nope. This is a distinction that seems too subtle for a lot of libertarians. The difference between having a choice and having to leave. For example, let's say you live in a condominium and are very fond of it. As long as you can move out, you have a choice. No matter how firmly you intend to stay, no matter how much you prefer your current condo, no matter how good or bad your current condo is for you, you still have a choice. This is analogous to living in a nation. You may choose which one to live in, and you can change. You may not be able to improve some things about it all by yourself, because it's not entirely yours. You have at least 4 choices: tolerate the social contract and perhaps try to amend it, leave by emigrating, violate it, or revolt. The next argument that comes up is, why should we be coerced to accept the social contract? Why can't we be left alone? And I would say you are not coerced to accept the U.S. government services any more than you are coerced to rent or purchase a place to live. If pretty much all territory is owned by governments, and pretty much all houses and apartments are owned, well, did you want them to grow on trees? There's no such thing as a free lunch. Some will argue we can't emigrate because there is no libertarian nation. And I would say, yes, you can emigrate, just as you could buy a different car, even though your favorite company doesn't produce cars which let you travel at the speed of sound and get 2,000 miles per gallon. Even if nobody produces exactly what you want, you can choose any car the market produces, or you create yourself. There are roughly 200 nations to which you could emigrate. They are the product of an anarcho-capitalist free market. There is no over-government dictating to those sovereign nations. Indeed, the only difference between the anarchy of nations and the libertopia is that anarcho-capitalists are wishing for smaller granularity. These nations have found that it is the most cost-efficient to defend themselves territorially. If any other market provided 200 choices, libertarians would declare that the sacred workings of the market blessed whatever choices were offered. The point is that choices do exist. It's up to libertarians to show that there is something wrong with the market of nations in a way that they would accept being applied to markets within nations. Libertaria is a combination of values that doesn't just exist. The government equivalent is really a posh residence for very little money. You can find nations which have much lower taxes, etc. Just don't expect them to be first class. And the reason these combinations don't exist is probably simple. The free market of government services essentially guarantees that there is no such thing as the free lunch libertarians want. It's not competitive. Another argument, extortion by the state is no different than extortion by the mafia. This is a prized piece of libertarian rhetoric because it slides in the accusation that taxation is extortion. This analogy initially seems strong because both are territorial. However, libertarians consider contractual rental of land by owners, which is also fundamentally territorial, ethical, and consider coercion of squatters by those owners ethical. The key difference is who owns what. The mafia doesn't own anything to contract about. The landowner owns the land in a limited sense, and the U.S. government owns rights to govern its territory. These rights are a form of property, much as mineral rights are a form of property. Let's not confuse them with rights of individuals. Thus, the social contract may be required by the territorial property holder, the USA. Another argument, there is no such thing as rights to govern territory. You'd have to ignore an awful lot of history to claim this sort of property didn't exist. The U.S. government can demonstrate ownership of such rights through treaty, purchase, bequeathment by the original colonies and some other states, and conquest. The exact same sources of all other forms of land ownership in the U.S. Also note that governance rights are merely a subset of the rights that anarcho-libertarians would want landowners to have. For example, insistence on contractual obedience to regulations and acceptance of punishment for violations. The next argument is, why should I be told what to do with my property? That infringes on my rights of ownership. This question comes up rather often since absolute ownership of property is fundamental to most flavors of libertarianism. Such propertarianism fuels daydreams of being able to force the rest of the world to swirl around the immovable rock of your property. For example, there were trespass lawsuits filed against airlines for flying over property. A good answer is, what makes you so sure it's yours? To which they may reply, of course it's my property. I paid money and I hold the deed. But what do you hold the deed to? Property is recognized by a government. As such, you can address infringement of your rights through the legal system. However, your property as recognized by the legal system is limited. This isn't too surprising since limitations created by private transactions are also common. For example, property is often sold without water rights or timber rights. Property is commonly sold with easements. For example, a neighbor may have the right to cross to reach the road. Any property may be sold with limitations to its usage. For example, the Adirondack State Park was bequeathed to the people of New York State with the stipulation that it remain forever wild. Most government limitations on property are analogous, and you bought property that was already under those limitations. Just as it would be wrong to deny the validity of an easement sold by the previous owner, it is wrong to deny the validity of the current system of limited ownership of property. For example, a clear statement of such an easement is in the Fourth Amendment, which essentially says that the government can enter your property with a valid search warrant and not be trespassing. There are many existing limitations, such as government rights to tax and to zone property, limitations to ownership of navigable waters, how far property extends to the water, etc., and sometimes new limitations are specified, such as non-ownership of airspace above property. And, the counter-argument may be that new limitations on use of property are a taking and should be compensated. And, some new limitations can be viewed as merely making specific that what was claimed was never really owned. For example, where was the ownership of airspace above property ever explicitly granted in our system of property? Where were polluters ever explicitly granted the right to dump wastes into air or water that they do not have a title to? Other limitations, such as rezoning to eliminate undesirable business or protecting wetlands from development, might be viewed as control of negative externalities. Most libertarians would recognize the right of a mall owner to write his leases so that he could terminate them if the renters caused externalities. Why shouldn't communities have the right to self-governance as well? And, another argument that is pretty common is think how much wealthier we'd be if we didn't pay taxes. This is a classic example of libertarians not looking at the complete equation for at least two reasons. First is if taxes are eliminated, you need to purchase services that were formerly provided by the government. The second is that if taxes are eliminated, the economics of wages have changed, and wages will change as well. Another argument is we lived in a fairly libertarian society in the US 150 years ago. Classic libertarian roll back the clock argument that sounds good at first because none of us directly remembers it. Libertarians do usually remember and criticize some of the more prominent non-libertarian features of that period, such as unequal protection of the laws for blacks and women. However, they seem to overlook a lot of other important things. Yes, the federal government had a much lighter hand then. However, state and local governments had a much greater degree of influence. There's not one class of positive duty or obligation in the US today that did not exist 200 years ago at state or federal level. All the biggies were there except income tax. The equivalent of income tax was property tax on all possessions, or head tax by many states. There was involuntary conscription, eminent domain, etc. As a matter of fact, things got much better when powers of states were interpreted to be restricted by the US Constitution much later. Powers such as state religious authority. Also, society was organized quite differently before the Industrial Revolution spread to the US. Our nation of shopkeepers was actually a nation of farmers. This means production were controlled primarily by the workers, who were the owners of the farms and the shops. Government of that era would be as out of place today as the tariffs and scientific knowledge of that era. Another argument is that might makes right is the principle behind statism. And I would argue that no, might makes ability to make something right or wrong. You can't even try for right until you have might to back it up in the real world. That's the reason that some real governments have survived and all utopian governments that have tried to abolish force have failed. However, government is not alone in requiring might. All property is based on what might as well. No one is beholden to your notions of what constitutes your property. Property is just as involuntary as the social contract. There is no moral obligation for anyone to respect your property, only a practical one. Some say, I want self-government, not other government. Self-government is a libertarian newspeak for everybody ought to be able to live as if they are the only human in the universe, if only they believe in the power of libertarianism. It's a utopian ideal like those of some Marxists and born-agains who would essentially require some sort of human perfection to work. More explicitly, self-government is the peculiar notion that other people ought not to be able to regulate your behavior. Much as we would like to be free of such regulation, most people also want to be able to regulate the behavior of others for practical reasons. Some libertarians claim that they want the first so much that they would be willing to forego the second. Most other people feel that they both are necessary and that it would be hypocritical or stupid to want just one. Why shouldn't we adopt libertarian government now? Because there are no working examples of libertarian cities, states, or nations. Innumerable other ideologies have put their money where their mouths are, if not their lives. Examples include most nations that have had Marxist revolutions, Israel, many of the American colonies, a large number of religious and utopian communities, etc. Yet libertarians want us to risk what many of them consider the best nation in the world with their untested beliefs. It's not even sensible to convert here first for the claimed economic benefits of libertarianism. There would be less marginal benefit to converting the USA to a libertarian system than most other nations. Let libertarians bear the risk and cost their own government experiment. Let libertarians point to a successful libertarian program and seek our endorsement. For example, narcotic decriminalization in the Netherlands has been a success. So has legalized prostitution in Nevada and Germany, and probably other places. Privatization of some municipal services has been successful in some communities, but these are extremely small scale compared to the total libertarian agenda and do not rule out emergent problems and instabilities of a full-scale libertarian system. Another argument is there's a conspiracy to prevent a working libertarian experiment. Libertarians sometimes cite the Minerva Project, armed squatting on a Tongan island at an attempted overthrow of the government of Suriname. If libertarians are too inept to compete internationally through diplomacy, politics, bribery, or force of arms, it hardly takes a conspiracy to explain that they lost. That's what sovereignty takes. King Libertarian experiment could be easily county-sized. A tiny religious sect was able to buy control of Antelope, Oregon, and relocate there a few years ago. The vastly more numerous libertarians could do much more. Privatize the roads, schools, libraries, police. Abolish property taxes, zoning, anything not required by the state. Then show the benefits. Yes, the state will prevent you from achieving some libertarian goals. Do what you can to show how you can improve things. You shouldn't have to go 100% libertarian to show marked benefits according to most libertarian claims. An event is explained by the issue at hand. This is really a class of argument post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is made all too often by arguers of all stripes. The claims made with this sort of argument by libertarians are innumerable. Counterexamples and other issues that plainly had influence are usually extremely easy to find. Here are some real examples that made it in APL. For example, the automotive recession that started in October 1989, which was the start of requirement that some cars of each manufacturer be fitted with airbags. Perhaps the reason that car sales have gone down is that many consumers are not willing to pay for a car with airbags. For example, there are as many military reasons why the draft is bad as there are moral ones. Witness our success using a volunteer army versus a conscripted one. It would be possible to collect libertarian examples of the other classes of fallacies of arguments, but this frequent one can serve as the exemplar. This particular one comes up a lot because of the lure of testing theory with reality. Haven't you read Libertarianism in One Lesson? Now, every belief system has its evangelistic writings designed to help convince or draw in new members. The Campus Crusade for Christ uses evidence that demands a verdict. Scientology uses Dianetics, and libertarians use libertarianism in One Lesson. All of these books are very convincing in the absence of counter-argument. However, they're easily rebutted by skeptics because they must omit the exceptions to their point of view to be convincing. If I cite a convert, libertarians like me believe in a simple morality. Everyone should be free to do what they like so long as they don't initiate use of force. If you're not familiar with this morality, I urge you to read Libertarian in One Lesson by David Bergland. I was personally shocked to find these things could be so neatly axiomatized. And what's even more remarkable is that the empirical world, societies, seem to me to be punished in an eye for an eye fashion from their deviation from the simple morality. We're deviating quite a bit and suffering accordingly. In my view, this is why economic growth is stagnating, the inner cities are dying. Anytime I read how simple it is to understand the world through System X, I know I'm dealing with a convert from evangelistic writings. They blithely assert that their explanations show the true cause of current problems, and the key to showing them to being so wrong is to show that there's more complexity to the world than is encompassed by their simplistic explanations. Similarly, have you read No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority? No Treason is a lengthy rant that doesn't take longer than the first paragraph to begin its egregious errors. For example, in the first paragraph, the Constitution, purports at most to be only a contract between persons living 80 years ago. Thus, he focuses his attention on the preamble and evidently ignores Article 7, which says exactly who contracted for the Constitution. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states of so ratifying the same, done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present, the 17th day of September, in the year of our Lord 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, in the 12th, in the witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names, signatories for states omitted. He's wrong on this simple matter of fact. The Constitution says who contracted with whom, But then he goes on to make a big deal about the people of that era being dead, as if contracts between organizations elapsed when their office holders depart. The rest of his analysis is equally as shoddy and consists largely of calling governments a collection of thieves and murderers at least 75 times. David Friedman, in The Machinery of Freedom, says Spooner attacks the contract theory of government like a lawyer arguing a case. But real presentations of cases have to cope with counter-arguments and can't depend so heavily on individual presumptions, which are easily shot full of holes. Another argument is libertarians oppose the initiation of force. How noble. And I'm sure that in a real libertarian society, everybody would hold to this morality as much as Christians turn the other cheek. /sarcasm. Initiation of force is another libertarian newspeak term that does not mean what the uninitiated might think. Libertarians accept defense of property and prosecution of fraud and call them retaliatory force. But retaliation can be the initiation of force. I don't need force to commit theft or fraud. This is a bit of rhetorical sleight of hand that libs like to play so they know they can pretend they are different than government. You know, break a law like not paying your taxes, and men with guns initiate force. Sorry, but you gotta play fair. It can't be initiation for government and retaliation for you. Like most other non-pacifistic belief systems, libertarians want to initiate force for what they identify as their interests and call it righteous retaliation, and use the big lie technique to define everything else as evil initiation of force. They support the initial force that has already taken place in the formulation of the system of property and wish to continue to use force to perpetuate it and make it more rigid. The National Libertarian Party membership form has the pledge on it. I do not believe in or advocate the initiation of force as a means of achieving political or social goals. It's quite amusing to hear how much libertarians disagree over what it means, whether it is or isn't okay to overthrow the U.S. because it has initiated force and they would be retaliating. Beyond this perceived class interest, libertarian dislike of initiation of force isn't much different than anyone else's. It must be a humanitarian, defensive, etc. Another argument is Dred Scott and the fugitive slave laws were examples of government enforcement of slavery. No, there's a subtle distinction. They were enforcement of property rights of slave owners. It was entirely the owner's assertion that the property of the government was acted upon. If the slave owner had at any time freed him, he would not have been a slave. Libertarians would love to lay slavery at the feet of government, precisely because slavery is a sin of capitalism. The U.S. government never enslaved the blacks. The U.S. government never said, you must now own this slave, or you've never been a slave before, but you are one now. U.S. slavery was initiated by capitalists. The U.S. government was not in the business of proclaiming people free or slaves. That was a private sector responsibility until that evil statist Lincoln stole the sacred private right for the state. Until that time, only private capitalist owners had the right to declare whether a black person was free or slave. There's this next little thing called the world's smallest political quiz, also known as the Nolan test. Now, this libertarian quiz asks a set of leading questions to tempt you to proclaim yourself a libertarian. The big trick is that if you answer yes to each question, you are a macho self-governor. There is an unspoken sneer to those who would answer anything else. It's an ideological litmus test. The most obvious criticism of this quiz is that it tries to graft the range of politics onto only two axes, as if they were the only two that mattered, rather than the two libertarians want the most change in. For example, if socialists were to create such a test, they would use a different set of axes. The second obvious criticism is the typical of polls taken to show false levels of support. The questions are worded to elicit the desired responses. This is called framing bias. For example, on a socialist test, you might see the question, do you believe people should help each other? Libertarians answer yes to this question, but the problem is the buts that are filtered out by the question format. Many libertarians use this as an outreach, read evangelism tool. By making it easy to get high scores on both axes, subjects can be told that they are already a libertarian and just didn't know it. This is the same sort of suckering that cold readers and other frauds use. The Libertarian Party, America's third largest political party. Wow, third. That sounds impressive until you realize that the Libertarian Party is about 1% of the size of the other two. Funny how they don't mention that in their slogan. At this point, expect to be called a statist. Don't be surprised if you receive some ad hominem abuse from libertarian evangelists when you don't accept their arguments. It's no different than if a communist called you bourgeoisie or a bircher called you a commie lover. Sometimes they'll go overboard and even accuse you of a mental disease, at which time you can point out to them that the fine company they keep is Stalin and Hitler, etc. Some people may ask, why do you spend so much time trying to debunk? As I once told a group of creationists, it's interesting to me to study unusual beliefs for the same reason it's interesting for doctors to study pathologies. When debating libertarians, it's important to be aware of their common arguments and fallacies they use to support their positions. By being prepared, you can avoid being steamrolled by their rhetoric and can more effectively refute their arguments. Libertarians love to claim that they are the only defenders of freedom and liberty, but this is simply not the case. In reality, they are often just the most vocal advocates of laissez-faire capitalism, which is not only exploitative, but also creates conditions ripe for social inequality. Libertarianism is also inherently selfish, placing the individual above all else. This directly clashes with the idea of solidarity and cooperation that is essential for a functioning society. Libertarians love to paint themselves as the saviors of freedom and liberty, when in reality they are nothing more than apologists for exploitation and social inequality. Their selfishness directly clashes with the idea of solidarity that is essential for functioning society. We should reject libertarianism in favor of more humane and equitable systems that benefit everyone, not just the wealthy few. And that, my friends, is the end of today's episode of the Half-Baked Libertarian. I hope I gave you some useful information. Remember to go ahead and click like, subscribe, all that good shit. And remember, stay half-baked.